Okay, well, welcome everybody, and thank you for what I understand is the last formal event of the Capitol Hill Ocean Week conference. I hope you all have had a chance to participate in many of the amazing programs, and especially because it's relevant to this conversation, the first session that took place yesterday morning, and I hope you had a chance to listen to Dr. Francis Gulland, the chair of the Marine Mammal Commission, and our own Naomi Rose, who is moderating this panel, because both of them spoke about the MMPA and its history and gave an incredible overview. There's not a real lot for me to say, but because some of you may not have heard what they had to talk about, I'm going to do a quick overview that really sets the foundation for the presentations from Tim and Francine, who will follow me. What I want to talk about is what Congress had in mind in 1971 and 1972 when it was putting the MMPA together. First, it identified key purposes that it hoped to accomplish through this landmark legislation. The foremost purpose of the MMPA was to achieve the health and stability of the marine ecosystem of which marine mammals are a part. Keep that in mind as we go through the rest of this presentation. That was the top priority that Congress had in mind. Not surprisingly, Congress was looking at achieving species protection, particularly bringing all species to the point where they were at their optimum sustainable population level. Habitat protection was a goal. The MMPA recognized the importance of scientific research and obtaining more knowledge and information about marine mammals that could serve as the basis for conservation and management actions. Because of their highly migratory nature, international cooperation through treaties and agreements was also considered a priority goal that Congress had in mind when it enacted the statute, and it set the overall objective of achieving zero mortality of marine mammals in human activities. So this is a key excerpt from the legislative history of the MMPA in 1971. If you just scan through this, you can see some of the key concepts, that there was a lack of knowledge about marine mammals and the causes that were affecting their decline, that they were almost all threatened in some way, and that a law should be enacted that would require the federal government to act conservatively with a bias in favor of marine mammal conservation. So when going through the legislative history of the statute and looking for the specific issues that caused Congress to say in 1971, let's look at developing an act to protect marine mammals. What was it that they had in mind? Commercial whaling was at a high point in the late 1960s and going into the early 1970s, with over 100,000 great whales being killed every year. Congress decided that the United States should take a leadership role in doing something to address the excessive harvest of great whales in commercial whaling, if not bring an end to commercial whaling. The tuna dolphin controversy was just becoming fully available to the public, where information made it clear that about 400,000 dolphins were being killed every year by the U.S. tuna fleet through its fishing practices. The baby harp seal harvest in Canada drew a lot of public attention and concern and opposition, which led to the establishment of a ban on importation. Polar bear sport hunting was also specifically pointed out by the congressional committees as a reason to have controls over hunting and to do something to regulate the amount of marine mammals that were being killed in hunting activities. Sea otters in California had been rediscovered. It was thought that they were extinct a few decades prior to this, but it became very clear that the federal government had to take some action in order to protect and achieve recovery of the sea otter population. Manatees were being hit by motorboats in Florida, causing them to be at risk of extinction. And as indicated by the primary purpose of the MMPA to achieve ecosystem health and stability, Congress recognized habitat degradation as a significant threat to marine mammals, and as a specific form of habitat degradation, overfishing and the depletion of prey base upon which many marine mammals were dependent. So based on those purposes and based on those specific problems, Congress enacted a sweeping and precedent-setting law that had a number of key tools. Just to list through these quickly, it preempted all state law, brought all authority over marine mammals into the federal government. It applied the prohibitions of the MMPA to U.S. citizens who are acting outside of United States waters and on high seas and in international waters. It established the optimum sustainable population goal, and to help achieve that goal, it established a moratorium and prohibitions on the take of marine mammals and the importation of marine mammals, except in certain circumstances where the MMPA identified procedures that could be used to authorize take or importation in limited circumstances and subject to terms and conditions and restrictions. Acting upon that quote from the legislative history, Congress made it clear that the MMPA would include a conservative bias where judgment calls had to be made in favor of marine mammals, and it imposed a heavy burden on applicants who are seeking authorization to take or import to show that that conservative bias had been satisfied. Not part of the original MMPA, but after several decades, a provision was added that required conservation plans to be prepared for those marine mammals that were at greatest risk, and a stranding response network was established. Both of those tools related back to the original purposes of the MMPA. So that's the basic foundation of the law that we're going to be talking about. And Tim and Francine will talk about some of the issues associated with implementation and how we look forward to fulfilling those purposes in the years to come.
Thank you very much, Don. And if you, you've already stopped sharing your screen. So our next speaker is Dr. Tim Reagan, whose career has focused on endangered, threatened, and depleted marine mammals. He served as the scientific program director and then the executive director for the Marine Mammal Commission before retiring in 2013. I just want to remind everyone that if you do have questions as we move forward, please do put them in the chat. Go ahead, Tim.
I'm just a little bit early here. See if I can get up. Oh, come on. All right, thanks. Whew. Strengths and weaknesses in Marine Mammal Protection Act. I'm just going to give you an oversight of some of the ones that have been most important to me. The first one is that I think the Act provided, as Don mentioned, a really helpful conceptual model for how we should manage marine mammals. Basically, what it said is we need to keep marine mammals somewhere between K, the environmental carrying capacity, and MNPL, the maximum net productivity level. If a population is in that range, we call that the optimum sustainable population level. If it's below that, we call that depleted, and that was then the key to initiating more protective actions. It's been a really functional model simply because it is biologically relevant, and it also places an emphasis on the ecosystem role of a particular marine mammal population. The other thing that I would emphasize is the concept called the potential biological removal level. With marine mammals, we passed the Marine Mammal Protection Act to deal with the high levels of mortality. And the question that arose was, how much mortality can a population tolerate? The potential biological removal model was developed to try to give us an idea of how many marine mammal individuals could be taken from a population before you would drive it down from its OSP level or prevent it from recovering into that OSP level. It's a relatively simple equation, but has been very functional in terms of a first goal in protecting marine mammals. Now, marine mammal protection has worked for a lot of populations and species, but it hasn't worked perfectly for all species. Here you get a glance of a few of the populations. The AT1 population of killer whales in Alaska will be extinct when the last living individual dies. That population hasn't reproduced since the early 1980s. The vaquita on the upper right is down to about 10-ish, and it is right on the edge, as is the western population of the North Pacific right whale. The Cook Inlet Beluga whale population has not recovered like it should have after we stopped sustainable harvesting on that population. And the North Atlantic right whale has bounced back and forth between about 350 and 450 without strong signs of recovery. One of the reasons that these populations haven't done well is that we still are having indirect or unintentional effects. This is an example showing a northern fur seal with some debris from a trawl net around it. And this is what happens when you have debris around one of these animals. The animal on the right, actually the debris was a single strand of cotton string. But the problem with these things is that they get around the animal, or the animal investigates them and gets them over their neck, and then they stay there and the animal grows. And so these wounds occur over a period of months or years, and they are pretty gruesome. We have other kinds of indirect or unintentional effects. You all know that we're having more ship strikes with large whales as the whale populations recover. That can either be by blunt force mortality, or a ship can dice up a marine mammal, as you see in the bottom picture with the Hawaiian monk seal, or not Hawaiian monk seal, hunchback whale, sorry, humpback whale. We also have lots of problems with habitat. I would say one of the real weaknesses for the Marine Mammal Protection Act is that it does not give us a lot of specifics for how to protect habitat. So we have problems with oil spills in the upper left, harmful algal blooms in the upper right. You've probably all seen the lower left picture of climate change with polar bears. And on the lower right, we have the effects of shipping and other sources of noise in the marine environment. And for marine mammals, noise is a really critical sense. Now, the Marine Mammal Protection Act is no good if you don't implement it. The vaquita declined from just under 600 animals in the late 1990s down to about 10 now. We watched that decline. It was steady, and they declined because the animals were being entangled in gill nets set for shrimp. The shrimp was sold primarily to the US, so we were the market for that fishery. And according to the act, we should have stepped in and said no more importing into the US as long as you don't have protective measures for the vaquita that are as good as our measures in the US. We didn't do that, and I think that was a major contributing factor for the vaquita. I think we're doing the same thing right now with the Maui dolphin off the North Island of New Zealand. There are about 54 Maui dolphins left. And last, I'll say, even in my neighborhood with the southern resident killer whale population, we have known for a while, for years, that recreational boats, whale watching boats, and so on cause noise that disturbs the behavior of southern resident killer whales. The Marine Mammal Protection Act defines level B harassment as harassment that has the potential to disrupt marine mammal behavioral patterns, including feeding. And we've known that they've had that problem, but in my view, NOAA has really not stepped up to the plate to address it. The state of Washington has restricted the amount of whale watching that it can occur, but it still occurs to an extent. And this is a population that's in real trouble in terms of its survivability. So I will end my part by saying that the Marine Mammal Protection Act will not save marine mammals. It merely reminds us of our obligation to do so and gives us the opportunity to do so. But in order to save marine mammals, it's us that has to step forward and do what we're supposed to be doing under the Act. That's it. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tim. Our final panelist is Dr. Francine Kershaw. She's the senior scientist with the Natural Resources Defense Council, and she leads NRDC's work to end large whale entanglements and also focuses on advancing responsible offshore wind development. And her PhD focused on ecology and evolutionary biology. And again, I'd like to remind everybody that if you have any questions, please do put them in the chat. Go ahead, Francine. Thank you.
Thank you, Naomi, for the kind introduction. It really is a pleasure to be with you all here today at CHOW and ending out all of the sessions. It's a real privilege. So I've been tasked with looking ahead to some of the challenges we may face in the next 50 years and to think about some of the conservation solutions we might like to, and in many cases need to advance to tackle them. Our ocean is changing rapidly and in significant ways, including areas in and around the United States. When the Arctic sea ice reached its minimum extent on September 15, 2020, it was the second lowest minimum since the start of the satellite record in 1979. And in recent decades, Arctic melting seasons have been growing longer and much of the older, thicker ice has been lost. The Gulf of Maine is warming faster than 96% of the world's ocean, and the warming is leading to changes in the community composition, including for commercial fisheries, as well as the distribution of Calanus, a species of zooplankton that is the preferred prey of the critically endangered North Atlantic right whale that Tim referenced. And the marine heat wave in the Northeast Pacific created an unprecedented mass of warm, nutrient-poor water that emerged off the Pacific coast from 2013 on, and you may have heard this called the blob. And the heat wave caused ecosystem-wide food web disruption, leading to the mass mortality of seabirds and a suite of other fish, mammal and bird species during 2014 through 2017. And in addition to warming, there is also, of course, the issue of increasing ocean acidification that is likely to have significant impacts on species that are foundational to many marine food chains. And marine mammals are already experiencing the effects of these changes. Hawaiian monk seals are losing important coastal habitat where they raise and care for their pups due to inundation and erosion caused by sea level rise. At French frigate shoals in 2018, only 57% of pups born survived to weaning, whereas that percentage averages 95% throughout the rest of the Northwest Hawaiian Islands. Peaks of first seen distemper virus in seals, sea lions, and sea otters has been found to correspond with reduction in Arctic sea ice extent, somewhat surprisingly so, and that indicates how little we know about how climate change will affect marine mammal health. And off the East Coast again, North Atlantic right whales are coming into increased conflict with fishing gear and vessels as they try to track their rapidly shifting prey. And these interactions are currently driving the species rapidly towards extinction. And human behavior is changing too. As Arctic ice melts, there will be an increased need for military defense that will introduce harmful Navy sonar and explosives into what now represents some of the quietest remaining ocean on Earth. New vessel routes will also open up and indeed already planned, increasing the risk of vessel strike and more noise in the Arctic environment. Noise from vessels, military exercises, and other human activities is particularly concerning for marine mammals in the Arctic, as they've been exposed to very little noise to date, and so can be expected to be disproportionately affected. And then new industries like aquaculture and offshore wind are also on the horizon in the United States, and indeed offshore wind is now rapidly taking off. The potential effects on marine mammals and the broader ecosystem for both these industries are still largely unknown. So we need solutions that are responsive to these dynamic conditions and uncertainties. So managing populations at significant risk from climate change poses a real challenge, and as of now, the MMPA does not provide a complete framework to meet it. As already stated, many marine mammals are already experiencing the effects of climate change, and some, like this poor ice-dependent spotted seal here, acutely so. Yet we don't have a good understanding of how climate change will impact marine mammals writ large and in the longer term. And the development and implementation of adequate and proactive conservation management measures is needed even in the face of these uncertainties. So we need to start developing solutions now. And one potential solution is to develop climate impact management plans for the most vulnerable species and populations. These plans would include not only conservation and recovery actions to mitigate climate impacts, but also actions to monitor, reduce, and prevent current interactions with harmful human activities. So those activities that are already existing or may occur in the future due to climate change. And reducing these existing threats to marine mammals will help bolster their resiliency to other less predictable impacts of climate change as they occur. And then as climate change is having significant effects on marine mammal prey, including in terms of distribution and prey quality, it would also be helpful to create plans to specifically monitor and manage prey availability. So getting into some of those ecosystem management aspects that were mentioned earlier. And finally, we still have significant gaps in knowledge regarding emerging threats to marine mammals, and it would be very helpful to develop a report that could be presented to Congress that synthesizes what we do know, but also identifies gaps and makes recommendations for actionable conservation measures. So to very quickly summarize, the MMPA is effective, but needs to be future-proofed to respond to new challenges posed by the direct and indirect effects of climate change. Protecting marine mammal habitats and reducing cumulative and chronic stresses will help increase the resiliency of marine mammals to whatever changes they're faced with. There is a wide range of innovative solutions and tools that could be used to address current and anticipated impacts. And work really should start now to address these existing threats and help us have the tools already in place when emerging ones occur. And with that, Naomi, I'll pass back over to you.
Thank you very much, Francine. I hope everybody learned something new today about the MMPA and the challenges it faces, and also the opportunities it presents. I would like to let you all know that the chat is open, so please let us know if you have any questions. I'm going to start the conversation with a question that's pretty open-ended. I would like each of the panelists to take to give us their take on it. So it's pretty simple. How would you change the MMPA if you could? So Don, why don't you start?
Okay, so if you think back to my presentation and where I listed the tools that are available to achieve the purposes. I think those tools were very effective at the outset of the act, really because what they were intended to do was to stop something. All the photographs I had of the problems that were identified by Congress in coming up with the legislation were something that they needed to stop. And the MMPA has been very effective in that. Not perfect, but tremendous progress has been made on just about every one of those issues, with the exception of the habitat-related concerns and ecosystem concerns. And I think a reason for that is the act is essentially has a negative focus. It's designed to stop harmful activities. It does not have much in its terms that is intended to impose affirmative, positive obligations on the federal government to do good things for marine mammals, to promote recovery. Stopping take and harmful importation were the tools that were identified, but you can't find anything in the MMPA that's like in the Endangered Species Act, Section 7A1, that imposes an affirmative duty on all federal agencies to use their authorities to promote the conservation or recovery of endangered species. And I think where this is particularly problematic is on the habitat and ecosystem provisions of the act. And just to illustrate that point, I'm going to read briefly from some oversight hearings that were conducted in 1974, where the Marine Mammal Commission was testifying and was actually sort of being called out on the carpet by the House Merchant Marine Fisheries Committee for not doing enough to get up and running. And this is a statement by Dr. Vic Sheffer, who was the chair of the commission at the time. And he's responding to criticism about not doing enough. And his response was, well, in fact, you have been very helpful to me in thinking of some topics which our general counsel, not me at the time, when and if appointed, will help us with continuing to steer a course between the things that we must do and the things that we really should not be bothered with. It comes down to codifying the act, sharpening up the intent. You will certainly agree that there are many definitions, I think in section 3, which are wide open. Health and stability of the marine ecosystem is a rather rough one. I would like to set somebody working on that definition. 1974. In 2022, we still don't know what it means.
Right. Tim.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And as I pointed out in my statement, I really do think we need to work on habitat protection because that's become so much more critical recently with climate change, with harmful algal blooms, dead zones, on, the list goes. And we don't necessarily have programs to deal with those. So that's important. I completely agree with Don's statement about requiring the agencies that manage marine mammals, that they need to take an affirmative position on protecting marine mammals. Too often we wait for and put the burden of proof on someone else, someone outside who's saying we need to protect these animals, but it should be the agencies in my mind that are leading that charge. The other thing that I think was important, and that's kind of come to me as a result of this little symposium here, is that we need to integrate the marine mammal protection or marine mammal protection with all the other things going on in our lives. It's one thing to say that we're doing marine mammal protection over on the side, but as Francine just indicated, we'll have all kinds of activities that affect marine mammals. And until we figure out how to integrate those things, marine mammal protection, even ocean protection sometimes takes far too low of a priority. It's hard to compete with a war in Ukraine, with the economy, gas prices, and everything else. But we are losing our environment to decay or to climate change, et cetera, all the while that we're not addressing these things. So I think figuring out how to integrate marine mammal protection into a larger picture is pretty important for us too.
Thank you, Tim. Francine.
Yeah, thanks, Naomi. And yeah, I agree with everything that Don and Tim has just shared. I think that the one thing I would add is building off of some of the recommendations in my talk is that I would build in more mechanisms to proactively address future impacts of climate change, of other potential future stresses, even in the face of scientific uncertainty. You know, a couple of ways to do that could be those climate impact management plans I mentioned in my talk. I'm looking at prey, but I think being able to act and having a solid framework and a mechanism under which to act even when things are uncertain are really important, and something we'll probably need to increasingly rely on going forward.
Right. And so that gets back to the precautionary principle. And so I'm going to once again ask folks to put in the chat, put their questions in the chat. But we do have one, and it's from one of the members of the Marine Mammal Commission, actually, and I think it's great. So it's directed at Tim, and I'll start with him, but, you know, Francine and Don, feel free to weigh in afterwards. Tim, do you see any change to the MMPA that could be realistically made to give it more teeth when an agency fails to uphold it by taking sufficient precautionary actions, which calls back to what Francine just said? Or, and I find this very, very close to my own heart, this next part of Daryl's question, or are we left with stakeholders suing the agency to hold them accountable? So in other words, are we always going to have to, our stakeholders, our citizens groups, always going to have to sue the government to make things happen? So Tim, what do you think of that? Sorry, that's my fault. There you go. Go ahead, Tim. There you go.
Yeah, there we go. Okay.
No, it was muting and unmuting. Sorry.
Okay. That was a perfect question. Earlier in my career, when I was the Stellar Sea Land Recovery Coordinator, we were looking at the impacts of fisheries on stellar sea lions. And I was told that it is better for someone to sue us to take the actions that we thought were necessary than for us to take them ourselves. And that's a problem. It suggests that our agencies do not have the gumption to do the things that they think are necessary in order to turn these declining species around. So that's really a critical issue, especially when you look at the challenges that are ahead with regard to climate change and other forms of habitat decline. If the agencies aren't anticipating, we're always going to be behind the 8 ball. I can give you an example with southern resident killer whales right now too. I mentioned that we're not protecting them from noise and so on. We need to take or assume the burden of proof ourselves that before we allow certain things to happen, that we have the information that says those things are not a problem. But we haven't done that. Not stellars, but southern resident killer whales are likely going to decline significantly in the next 15 years because we're going to lose a number of our reproductive females. Right now they have 24 reproductive females. In 15 years, I think we'll have on the order of 16. So about a third of our reproductive potential will be gone. We have to be able to anticipate and prepare for that rather than just wait for it to come and see what happens. So my answer to the question would be, we've got to be better about anticipating the problems that are coming, and we've got to be more willing to step out and say, no, these protections have to be in place until we are sure that they are not needed.
So Don or Francine, the question again was, do you see any change to the MMPA that could be realistically made to give it more teeth when the agency fails to act with sufficient precautionary actions, or are lawsuits the only way we can make the act work? Go ahead.
So I'll mention 3 things. That the qualifier about realistically is a difficult one because I think we're talking about getting Congress to amend the MMPA. And as we all know, that's very difficult to achieve. But there are 3 things I would look at. One is, as I mentioned in my opening presentation, there should be a general affirmative duty for federal agencies to use their authority to conserve marine mammals, similar to the provision in the Endangered Species Act. The second would be to have an appropriately focused requirement that will take into account the impacts on marine mammal habitat of federal agency actions. That can't be too broad. It can't just be habitat that's important, because with migratory species, you're going to end up with just about all the ocean waters in the United States that would be subject to this requirement. But if there is a way to focus on the really important habitat areas that are subject to negative impacts and adverse impacts, so that becomes factored into agency decision-making to try to mitigate those impacts or avoid them, that would be a very positive change. And finally, because I think the premise of the question is to get the agencies to do things that they aren't doing, is again looking to the Endangered Species Act to add a citizen suit provision that would allow plaintiffs to directly sue parties that are in violation of the MMPA and not have to rely upon Administrative Procedure Act lawsuits against the federal government.
Thank you. Francine, do you have any response?
Yeah, I think one thing I would briefly add to that is we also need an improved process for adaptive management. So the precautionary approach is of course important. We make the best decision we have, the most protected decision we have based on the available data we have at the time. But particularly as everything is rapidly shifting, we're going to be learning things all the time about how, we may not have got it quite right, or maybe this mitigation measure would have been more protective than the one that we thought in the beginning. And so we really need a process for agencies and agency actions to be continually looking at that data and revising and improving if we're going to adequately protect these species as we go forward. And I'm not aware of many good examples where that is currently happening. And so I think that could be an area that could be strengthened and really needs to be going forward.
Thanks, all of you. I think there's a lot of really good ideas in there, and I'm very pleased that CHOW is recording this. We'll go back through that. We have another question from the audience. So as you know, manatees off Florida have been in the midst of a die-off. So do you have any thoughts? And again, this is for the whole panel. Do you have any thoughts about the strengths and weaknesses of the MMPA as it addresses declines in vulnerable species? So when you have something like what is happening with the manatees, or for that matter, the southern residents, what are the strengths and weaknesses in the MMPA for addressing these? Anyone can go with that one.
Well, I am Naomi. I'm not at all a manatee expert, but I'm happy to share a thought on this. And I think this points to one area where the MMPA falls short right now, which is really looking at the broader ecosystem management needs when protecting marine mammal populations and stocks. And as I understand it, there have been massive recovery efforts underway. People have been working around the clock to, secure and protect the manatees that they can that are experiencing that die-off. But really, the fundamental issue here is a massive ecosystem level impact, which I believe is due mainly to water quality and will probably be exacerbated by, other oceanographic shifts and seagrass habitat stresses going forward. And I think looking at everything that a marine mammal needs from the ecosystem to survive and thrive is a way that the MMPA could be strengthened. And I certainly know my co-panelists have thoughts on that too, so can probably articulate that much better than I can. But yeah, that was my immediate thought when manatees came up.
And if I could go ahead and just make a couple of comments as well. With the manatees, there have been a lot of deaths. I think there were 1,100 last year. One of the things that I know they've been working hard to understand what's causing each of those deaths, but at some point there's so many that you really need to focus more on what the causes are and what you might do to reverse those. So for example, even though we're getting warming with climate change, we do have cold spells, and cold spells lead to manatee deaths. So we need to figure out ways that we can at least ensure that as power plants shut down in Florida coastal waters, that they are not shutting down those warming or thermal effluents that manatees have come to depend on. We have got to make sure that the nutrients that are going into fresh waters and then going into the nearshore environment that are sparking some of these algal blooms, et cetera, those really need to be managed well so that they aren't causing or contributing more of the problem. So I think that, again, putting it in a broader perspective, with all of the different human activities, boat strikes continue to be a problem with manatees. So we've got to continue to enforce those laws to keep those vessels, the small vessels, going slower to minimize the number of deaths there. And then I think also more support for the research people who are trying to figure out ways that they can provide protection for these animals, plus the fact that they will need more captive care. They're trying to feed a lot of manatees now that otherwise don't have access to good food. So if we're going to get through that, it's going to take multiple kinds of efforts to keep them as safe as we can in the coming years.
Don?
So I hate to sound like a broken record, but I think the manatee situation is a pretty good example of the need to be proactive, not just looking at regulating motorboats. That's an important part of it. Know how to do that, and that's been done for decades. And I think I don't know what the situation is with manatees in terms of a recovery plan under the ESA or the MMPA, but these are the types of issues, looking at the way to be looking at solving problems that recovery plans ought to address. And it's not enough to just do a recovery plan and put it up on the shelf. It is something that has to have life continuously breathed into it. There needs to be follow-up implementation by the agency responsible, whether it's the Fish and Wildlife Service for manatees or the National Marine Fisheries Service for its species. So I think putting more oomph behind recovery plans, making sure that they're current, and when situations arise, like is now happening with manatees, then there needs to be the ability to get back into those plans, or requirement to do so, in fact, so that they can be adjusted, identify the steps that need to be taken, and then have some basis for forcing those actions to occur.
All of a sudden we have two really great questions. I think I'm going to take, because we were told we have the ability to go a couple minutes over our time, I'm going to take I'm going to take these questions, but we don't really have a lot of time to answer them. So please keep your answers quick, and then I'll wrap everything up and let you all go. So the Smithsonian was talking about the possibility about Rice's whale. I like this question because it's bringing up this new species we've just recognized. For about a decade before it was actually officially recognized. Likewise, there's a new East Coast offshore bottlenose dolphin species. So now conservation action for Rice's whale may be too late because it took too long to recognize it as a separate species. So how can we better deal with the problem of marine mammal science being slow when threats are fast? So this gets back to the precautionary approach. How can we improve its implementation? Because science takes a long time, but conservation needs are sharp these days. Francine, I see you nodding your head, so why don't you start?
I was nodding my head because it's a problem that I share and a vexation I share, but I don't necessarily have a clear solution. I think, that the standard of best available scientific information doesn't require peer-reviewed publication. It can be, kind of anything, a white paper or emerging data and so on. So I think proactively engaging scientists that are working on these issues and making sure that any data that they are and information they are comfortable with is made available if they feel it's at a stage where it could be helpful for decision making. Could be one way to do that on the science side, but I will defer to my colleagues on the legal and policy side on how the MMPA could provide could be improved to streamline that process.
If I could?
Yes, please.
Yeah, first of all, I would say that I would never assume that a population is beyond help. Even with the AT1 population, there may be a remote possibility that another transient whale will enter that pod and something will change. But we have the situation with Vaquita, and I wouldn't write it off. We have this situation with the western population of North Pacific right whales. I certainly wouldn't write that off. And on and on. And if we look in the past, we have seen populations that we thought were even extinct, like the Guadalupe fur seal, that actually ended up recovering and is doing quite well now. So I wouldn't ever write one of them off. I do think that we could focus energy and effort. We have a tendency to sort of recognize that they're out there, but we don't jump in and do much. What have we done to really protect the North Pacific right whale, or the Western population in particular? Not much. So we could be doing more for those populations. Are we giving the scientists enough resources that they can go out and figure out what the problems are, what the issues are, what areas need to be protected, so that those animals are not, you lose a single animal in some of those populations, it's a problem. So I think we could be considerably more aggressive about how we deal with populations that look to be right on the edge.
Don?
So the first,
Really quick.
first issue is getting the information out there, get the science out there. Scientists, you've got a variety of ways you can do that. You don't have to wait for the peer-reviewed article. Second thing about the MMPA that is a really good thing is the existence of the Marine Mammal Commission, which is a forum for addressing scientific issues of this nature and doing so as they are arising and doing so quickly. Get the information in front of the commission. The commission can do its thing to bring a focus on the problem and recommend solution. And then there are a bunch of legal tools that can be employed for various purposes, but you got to have the scientific record to use them.
Okay, I think I'm going to have to wrap it up. There were a couple more questions, and right whales, of course, very important issue. But we are over time by a couple minutes, and I do want to wrap up by just pointing out, you may have all noticed that there is a logo in the upper right corner of each of our screens for the MMPA 50, it says. Well, this is a coalition of groups of NGOs that have been working to defend and strengthen the MMPA over the last 6 years. And currently our main focus is, of course, it's the 50th anniversary of the Marine Mammal Protection Act, 1972. And so we are going to have a series, and we have had a series of actions, outreach, education, and activities that we've urged the public to take part in. And the way to get at that is through the hashtag MMPA 50. The coalition is using that. Each individual member of the coalition is using that hashtag on social media to put out videos, activities, calls to action. And we are having a couple of further events during the year to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the MMPA, including at the Society for Marine Mammalogy's biennial conference in Florida in August, and then a fall event here in Washington, D.C. in September. The actual anniversary of the MMPA is in October, and we do all hope that you will follow us on social media and participate and engage in this, I think, very important celebration and consideration of the ways that this act has to move into the future in a positive way. So thank you all for attending. We really, really appreciate your participation. We want to thank the National Marine Sanctuaries Foundation for this entire Capitol Hill Ocean Week. It's been a great event, and thank you all for participating in this panel discussion.